I think the tests that God gives us serve a similar function. They're not designed to destroy us. They're designed to strengthen us and make our faith even stronger. Why do the wicked prosper? And then secondly, why do the innocent or the righteous suffer? You've probably asked both of those questions, but my guess is you've asked the second, the latter, more frequently. And it might express itself like this: why would God allow this to happen to me? I've tried to be faithful. Why is He asking that I walk through this shadow of the valley of death, this trial, this test? Why? Our text today is one of the more challenging scriptures or passages of Scripture. The Jewish people refer to this as the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac. It's a story that's troubled believers and readers of Scripture for thousands of years, and if we're honest, it ought to trouble us as well, because in this passage we encounter a God who asks His faithful servant more than what we think is even imaginable or should be imaginable. Remember that Abraham was called as a man named Abram from Ur of the Chaldees, which is over to the east of the Fertile Crescent. And God called him to leave his family and his father's house and to make his way across that Fertile Crescent over to the west, near the land of Palestine and Israel. And along with that call, God made the promise that I will make of you numerous nations, that your descendants will be as many as the stars in the sky or the sand and the beach. But year after year, Abraham and Sarah were childless. Abraham was 75 when God made this promise of a child, of an heir, and when he was 99, it had not happened yet, and God renewed that promise once again. When he was 100, Abraham was finally able to hold that child of promise in his arms. Isaac was born. And Isaac wasn't just Abraham's son, he was the embodiment of God's promise and the hope of all the descendants of Abraham from that point on. Every time Abraham looked at Isaac, he saw God's faithfulness, and a smile came to his face as he thought about the name Isaac, which means laughter. And then out of the blue, when everything seemed to be going well, God appears to Abraham again and says, "Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and take him to the land or the mountain of Moriah." The idea of child sacrifice was not a foreign thing for Abraham. It was unfortunately a part of many cultures in ancient times. It even became a part of Israeli or worship within Israel, with various kings sacrificing children in the fire. But to think that God, this God of faithfulness, would ask this of Abraham is beyond what we can imagine. This son of promise, the hope of Abraham and his people, the living proof of God's faithfulness, is now going to get placed on the altar. When God called Abraham out of Ur, He asked him to leave his family, and in a sense, He was asking him to give up the past. But now God is asking him to give up his future. The Scriptures are very clear to let us know that this is a test. This is not a real life situation. This is a simulation, as it were. Abraham was not clued in, but we as the readers are. So let me just mention three truths about tests in general that we understand from this text. First, the tests that God subjects us to might seem unfair to us, but they fulfill a purpose. This test for Abraham wasn't a punishment. Sometimes it can seem like the test of God is a punishment. Why are you doing this to me? I don't know if you've ever taken guitar lessons. Many of us, when we were younger, had this idea that I would love to play the guitar, right? And so you would go to a teacher and they would show you the chords and say, practice so many hours a day. Well, after the first few minutes, your fingertips start to get sore. They start to hurt a little bit. And then you go back and say, yeah, I think you misunderstood. I want to learn how to play the guitar, not tear up my hands. And the teacher would say, no, that's the way you learn how to play the guitar. You have to go through that process. And I know that when I was trying to learn, you would form blisters, and then the blisters would break. And then sometimes your fingers would bleed, and you think, what a cruel system of torture have these people devised just so that I can look cool and play the guitar? Well, over time, what happens is your fingers develop calluses. And it can be years, but if you play regularly, you'll be able to play all day, all night without any kind of pain. I think the tests that God gives us serve a similar function. They're not designed to destroy us. They're designed to strengthen us and make our faith even stronger. That's what James says in chapter 1. Consider it pure joy, my friends, when you're subjected to any number of different trials and tests, because you know and God knows the testing of your faith produces endurance. Abraham's test was extreme because of who God was calling him to be. Not just the father of Isaac, not just the husband of Sarah, but the father of an entire generation, and a generation that has no limit, because it's the generation of all the faithful, including even us. We are children of Abraham, and God was calling him to be that man of faith. And his test was perhaps harder than just about any other human's. The second thing about testing is that obedience sometimes requires action that we don't understand. It doesn't make sense to us. We don't see how this could be any good. What we see on Abraham's part is obedience. He follows and obeys God. He didn't understand it. He didn't know what was happening, didn't know how God was going to pull this one out of the hat, as it were. He simply followed God's instructions. It reminds me of a story I read a few years ago from World War II. During the time when the German planes were bombing London, everyone would have to go underground to the stations to find shelter during the air raids. And one night, as the bombs were falling above, a daughter was with her father and said, "Daddy, why are we here? I just don't understand this war. What's it all about?" And the father replied, "Sweetheart, you don't need to understand why Germany and England are fighting at war. You just need to trust that Daddy knows what's best, and he wants to keep you safe, and this is where you are safest." There are times when we don't understand why we have to experience something, but we put our trust in God because we know that He does know, and He is looking out for our very best interests. So God's tests may seem unfair, but they do have a purpose. Obedience sometimes requires action that is beyond our understanding. And number 3, faith believes God can work even beyond our worst case scenarios. This is where the story gets really amazing. In Hebrews chapter 11, this chapter of the Hall of Fame of the faithful, after introducing Abraham and talking about his faith in leaving his family behind, it talks about how he was willing to sacrifice his future. And the text in Hebrews 11 says that Abraham trusted God, that even if necessary, God could resurrect Isaac from the dead. And that wasn't what Abraham would have wanted, and we know that that's not what God wanted. But Abraham believed even if the very worst on earth happened, God was powerful enough to make it right one way or another. Abraham's faith was not blind. It wasn't naive. It was actually quite deep and profound. He trusted God to be more reliable than what his eyes could see, which is the very definition of faith. The climax to the story comes on the top of Mount Moriah, and God provides at the moment when it is needed the most. God provides a substitute sacrifice for Abraham. God's mercy came when it was needed. Wouldn't it have been better if God would have provided the ram for Abraham down below before they climbed up the mountain? Wouldn't it have been better if God would have said, hey, Abraham, just a heads up. You don't have to really do this. Everything's okay. God's timing is perfect. The problem is we don't know what God's timing is, and we get anxious and we get frustrated, and our faith falters. But at just the right time, God provided a ram, and that was so impactful for Abraham that he renamed that place. The Lord will provide, Jehovah Jireh. And this test ended up revealing Abraham's heart to God. God was able to see that Abraham was willing to do literally anything and everything to follow him. So what do we do with this story, this ancient story that just doesn't seem to make much sense in some ways to us? Well, first, I think we can recognize that God's tests often target our greatest treasures. The thing that we value most in life, the thing that has the greatest potential to stand in between us and God, is what is going to be tested. Isaac wasn't just Abraham's son. He was Abraham's greatest joy, his source of laughter, his source of identity, his hope for the future. I think we can safely say that Isaac was the thing or person that Abraham valued more than any other on earth. And that's what God asked. So what's your Isaac? Who is your Isaac? Children, your marriage, your career, your health, your dreams, your future? I don't know that God is going to ask all of us for that thing or person, but I think we should live life with those things in the palms of our hand, not gripping them so tightly that God has to break our fingers, but rather knowing that we have given this, God has given it to us, and we offer it back up to Him. There was a Christian rock group a couple years back, Sixpence None the Richer. I don't know if you remember them. They had a couple pop songs that kind of threw them off track because they wanted to be a Christian rock group, and they had some popular songs. Kiss Me, I think, was one, and there was another. I don't remember the name of it. But they were asked, where did you get this name? It sounds like a strange name. He said, well, we get it from a C.S. Lewis book. Because C.S. Lewis said, and as he was reflecting on our relationship with God, he said, you know, if a kid asks his father for sixpence, which is a coin, amount of money, if he asks his father for this money so he can go out and buy him a gift, and then the kid goes out and spends the sixpence to buy a gift for the father and then gives that gift to the father, is the father any richer? He paid for the gift. It was his money in the first place. He ends up with the same amount of money or gift that he had before the child asked. sixpence, none the richer. And that's how it is with God. Everything that we give God, it feels like such a sacrifice to us, but everything we give God, He's already given us. And all we're doing is placing it in our hands to say, God, this will never stand between me and you. Whatever it is, as hard as it is, we put it and keep it in open hands. Because the second thing is that we trust God's character when we don't understand His plan. Abraham didn't understand why God would ask him to do this sacrifice, but he did understand God's character. He had experienced God's faithfulness over and over in his life, and when the plan didn't make sense, he fell back on who he knew and what he knew about God. And I think that's probably the crucial point for us. When life doesn't make sense, when we get that diagnosis, or when that relationship that we thought was going to last forever ends, or when our dream and our hopes and our futures are smashed and dashed, we can anchor ourselves in God's unchanging character. He is good. He is loving. He is faithful. And those things don't change even though the world around us is spinning like crazy. The third thing is to look for God's provision in the place of testing. Abraham found God's provision on top of the mountain where he was being tested. And this is a pattern we see through Scripture. God provides what we need in the moment we need, not before, and obviously not after. At just the right time, the Scripture tells us, Jesus died for us. He often provides for us in the midst of the temptation. I remember talking with someone who was going through cancer treatments, and they said, I've experienced God's presence in ways I've never imagined or could have imagined during these months of treatment. I've seen His love through our church family, His strength in my weakness, His peace in the middle of my storm. I would never have chosen this trial, but I would never trade what I've learned about God now that I've lived through it. But you know, on top of everything else that we've already seen, there's one more layer of meaning that's extremely important for us. Genesis 22 doesn't talk about an example of faith that we should look to, where Abraham as a father was challenged by God to give up his son. Some 2,000 years later, not far from the top of Mount Moriah, where Jerusalem would later be situated, a father did sacrifice his only son whom he loved, Jesus. And that time there was no substitute, because Jesus himself was the lamb and he was the sacrifice. So whenever we struggle with how could God ever ask such a thing of Abraham, we remember that God is not asking of us anything that he hasn't asked of himself. The binding of Isaac whispers what the cross of Jesus shouts. God will go to any length to demonstrate his love for us. The righteous and the innocent will continue to suffer. And I don't know why, but I do know who. You and I know the God who tested Abraham and provided for him. You and I know the God who gave his own son for us. You and I know the God who has never failed to keep his promises. You might be climbing your own Mount Moriah today. Maybe God is challenging you with something that's just beyond what you think is even possible. Can I encourage you with Abraham's example? Take the next step of obedience even if you don't understand the plan. Trust God's character even when his ways seem mysterious. Look for his provision in the midst of the very test that you're experiencing. The same God who provided a ram for Abraham And the same God who provides his Son for us will continue to bless and guide our lives.